So we are at the two dots, 5 lines from the bottom on Mem Aleph Amid Beis. Shloisha lekuchas mitzdarfin. 3 lekuchas are mitzdarf. So the Rashbam explains this in some detail. It's worth it just to see it because we're going to be basing on Rav's observation about this. So shloisha lekuchas. What's the case of shloisha lekuchas? Zok the Rashbam. Sada sheyesh edim shahayz shel Ruven. A sada that we know belonged originally to Ruven. Ruven is the Marakam. Kolayom. The Hechzik Bosh Shimon Shana. And then Shimon was holding on to it for a year. Kitayin shekanami Ruven. Shimon says he bought it from Ruven. V'akach machar Shimon leLevi b'shtar. And then Shimon sold it to Levi with a shtar. V'hechzik Levi Shana. Levi had it for year. V'akach machar Levi liYehuda. And Levi sold to Yehuda with a shtar. Come on, v'hechzik b'shana. Harishol Shana. So you have 1 year. Reuben is the Marakam, is the original owner, and then Shimon, Levi, Yehuda each held it for 1 year. And they bought it with a. So Shimon claims he bought it from Reuben, and that's still up in the air. But there were shtaros from the sale of Shimon to Levi and from Levi to Yehuda. Basra Reuben kamar v'aymer kilay machul Shimon, and he comes to be Mar. He goes to Yehuda, who's currently holding on to the karka. And he says, I never sold it to Shimon. Between the 3 of us, we have a cheskes shalosh shanim. And you, Ruvain, you never complain. The Shimon and Shimon, who purchased it from you, and we're coming mikoyach the fact that he bought it from you. He has no responsibility to hold on to the shtar for more than 3 years. Reuven says back, I never made a macha, I never made a protest because there was never anyone who had a cheskes gimel shanim. Each person only had 1 year. She said, since all of you, each one of you were only brave enough to hold on to for a year, and then another person moved on. They said, none of these people are serious problems. I'm going to just ignore it. As we all know, the kaych of ignoring problems is one of the most powerful forces in the world. So he said, everyone's only a 1 year muhzik. I'm going to ignore it. I'm not dealing with this. I didn't know each one of you was selling it for one to the other. So the Rashbam continues mitzdarf and halakucha. So Yasser Reuven, and Reuven will lose out, and it is a cheskes gimel sham. The kivin the b'shtar lach kuzamizeh, since as Rav is about to say, they each had a shtar mechira, because the mafarish Rav is samach. Eidim shebishtar afkul lekala. The eidim on the shtar make a kol go out the idea Reuven. Reuven should have been aware that this land was being sold from one to the other because a shtar has a chazaka. Okay, fine. We'll leave that over. So that's the svara that we're saying over here that Reuven should have been aware. He can't say that there was no cheskes gimel shanim since it's 3 separate people. Since a shtar of sale has a kail, Reuven should have been aware of it. Rav says this is only if they were all with a shtar. Now, the Rashbam clarifies, obviously it doesn't mean there was a shtar between Ruvain and Shimon. It means all of the people making chazaka had a shtar. If Shimon had a shtar from Ruvain, there'd be nothing to talk about. Then he just produced a shtar. I will point out what seems to me a problem with this Rashbam, which I think has an answer, is we're saying Shimon bought it from Reuven, and then he sold it to Levi, and Levi sold it to Yehuda. We say that Shimon should have held on to his shtar until the 3 years are up, because up until 3 years, as long as Reuven is not Meicha. But I would think Shimon would just throw away his shtar as soon as he sells it to Levi. he no longer owns the property. So why is he holding on to a star from Reuven? But obviously the answer to that is because if something happens to the karka, if it's taken away from Levi or Yehuda by Reuven, they're going to come back to the person who sold it to them. Yehuda will go to Levi, and he'll get money back. He'll get compensated from Levi, and Levi will go to Shimon. So Shimon should have held it for up to 3 years until there's a chazak. So Rav says, but this din that 3 separate lekuchas, 3 people who sold it one to another can have a cheskes gimel shanim is only if they sold it with a star. That Ruvain has noticed that it's that the chazaka is still in play. That it's not just 3 independent people squatting on his land, but rather it's a sequence of purchases. So tomorrow, remember the Rav star is like kala ve'edim less like kala. It sounds like what Rav is saying is that it's only because it was a star that's how Reuven is given notice that he has to make a macha. But if it was just sold with edim without a star, then he wouldn't know. In fact, the Marva Amar Rav hamoicher sada be'edim goyvim menachasum mishubadim. Someone who sells a property with edim can be goyver from nechasum mishubadim. So we're talking over here. What's the case? Ruvain sold a property to Shimon. Let's see the Rashbam how he explains it. He took achrayas. Ruvain sold the property to Shimon, and he said that he took achrayas that if someone's going to take it away from Shimon, he's going to make good on it. Goiva halikeach min hamaycher. Shimon can take from the meicher. Fil man chasim sheshibed umeshkin oimacha kak oisav achro mechirazu shkoblachu yusuf. So let's make this case, okay? In December, Ruvain had borrowed money from Yehuda. December 1st, he borrowed money from Yehuda. Then on January 1st, he sold property A to Shimon. And then on February 1st, he sold property B to Levi. So we're saying over here that when Ruvain sold property A to Shimon, and now Yehuda, who is owed money from Ruvain, pops up and he says to Reuven, you owe me money. And Reuven says, I have no money. So he goes and takes property A away from Shimon. Now Shimon has achrayas. Shimon is entitled to be compensated by Reuven because the property he bought was taken away to pay up Reuven's pre-existing debt. So now Shimon goes to Levi. He goes to Reuven. Reuven has nothing to pay him with, so he's like any person. He now has created a new debt from Reuven to Shimon, and Shimon goes and takes the property from Levi. And this is even though Reuven had sold the property to Shimon without a shtar. He sold it only with Edom. And as we've said a number of times before, the whole way this whole system works is because a later purchaser should have looked into the recorded deeds. I mean, even though here we're talking about just with Edom, but he should have looked into the history and seen what Reuven's pre-existing debts are. So if we're going to allow Shimon to go take from Levi the property that Levi bought, it must be that Levi had the ability to be aware that Reuven had previously sold something to Shimon, because that would indicate the existence of a potential chiyuv, a potential debt, if that property is ever taken away from Shimon, that Shimon's going to go back to Reuven and take from any later purchasers. So we're seeing from here is the end result of all this is that Rav is saying, this is Rav again. Rav is saying that we assume Levi would have been aware of Shimon's purchase from Reuven, even though it was only done with Edom. Right? The case was he can even go and take, Shimon could go and take from the Chasim Shabbatim, meaning, as the Rashbam explains, from later sold properties, and the person who purchased it later is assumed to have known that Reuven had sold the property previously to Shimon, and therefore he's subject to having it taken away from him. It's only through Edom. There's no star. And Rav and Marmish Lagabi Chazaka said only a star gives notice to the original seller. That's the only time you have a koil is with the star. And for the Gemara, there's a difference. Hasam lekuchas inu afsidu anafshai. We say there's a major difference between the din that Rav had said that the original owner Reuven, in our case, should have been aware of where we say he's not aware if the chazaka was done by three separate purchasers who had sold with Edom, he wouldn't know about it. And the case of a lekuchas, of a lekeach, of Levi who's purchasing, and he's said to be responsible for knowing that Reuven had originally sold to Shimon. Because in the second case, when Levi is buying a property, he knows I'm making myself vulnerable here. I'm making myself vulnerable if it will turn out that there's a pre-existing debt. So he's expected to investigate to find out what is going on with Reuven, what possible previous debts he might have incurred. So just like he's supposed to know about direct debts, like the one that it turned out he actually had with Levi, he also should know about potential liability he should look into and find out if he sold to Shimon. So therefore, even though that was just done with Edom, since Levi is on the hook, if Reuven had a previous sale, he's supposed to look and find out, even if it was just with Edom. But in our case, Reuven is not engaged in any kind. He's saying, I never sold anything to anyone. And there's just a bunch of squatters on my land. But that's not enough for me to investigate if they're making sales. I'm just an innocent bystander here. I'm not someone who put myself in a position by buying something where I have to look to see what kind of previous sales. So in that case, only if the three machzikim, the three consecutive machzikim sold to each other with a star, we say that Reuven should have known about. Sagt the Gemara, Umi Amar Rav Hachi. Does Rav hold? We're going away from Rav's din that he said over here. We're just going to focus on this new din that we just brought. That Rav says where a property was sold, when one property was first sold, property A was first sold to Shimon by Reuven, and then property B was sold to Levi by Reuven, that even if the property was sold to Shimon with just Edom, without a star, Levi should have known, and therefore Levi's property is subject to reclamation by Shimon if Shimon's property is taken away from him and he comes to act on his guarantee to Reuven. Is that true? But someone who lends property, makes a loan, right? Shimon lent to, let's go back to our original case. Levi lent to Reuven with a star. If it turns out that he goes back to make a claim on his loan, Levi wants to get his money, and Reuven says, I don't have any money. He could take from subsequent purchases. But that's with star. But if he is al yedei Edom, he can only take from Nechayim. So this is saying, even though we said that a subsequent purchaser is supposed to investigate, we're saying even so, exactly the opposite of what we just quoted b'Shem Rav. So we have a Mishnah that L'chayra says the opposite of Rav. It says, even in a case of a later purchaser who's supposed to look and see whether there's a pre-existing debt. If the halva was only with Adam and not with Star, we don't expect that he knows about it, and therefore you can't take it away from him. If you'll say, we just asked the Kasha from Mishnah on Rav, maybe Rav disagrees with the Mishnah. This Mishnah holds that a shibud of Adam is not sufficient. I'm sorry, a halva, a debt of with that's entered into through Adam is not enough to give notice to a later purchaser. And Rav says it is. Milva al peh ain't a goyva loyman al yashin v'loyman al kukus. That if someone makes a halva al peh, meaning with just aid and without a star, he can't be goyva from the yashin v'loyman al kukus, which is our case. We see Rav specifically says, just like this Mishnah, that someone can be goyva, cannot be goyva from the kukus if it's just adim, because adis, even in the case of a later purchaser, he doesn't know about a previous halva that happened only through Adam. That's Saisa, what Rav had paskin what Rav had paskin on the bottom of the Yom. Again, the case of Chazak is a different case. We were able to mimchal, but this new din, l'chayru, he's Saisa. He's Saisa himself. In fact, the Gemara Malva Zvini Karamis. Gemara says there's a big difference. It's true that Rav had said that when Levi buys a property from Ruvain, he is going to be aware of Shimon's previous sale, and therefore he's going to be responsible. But he doesn't mean he's necessarily aware of any debts that Ruvain had incurred without a star, because they're different. Milva ki kayaza betzidikaya. When someone borrows money, when Reuven borrows money, like we said in our case, that Reuven borrowed money from Levi, he's very embarrassed about it. He doesn't want people to know he's borrowing money. Once he's known that he's in debt, people will pay less for his properties because they know he's under pressure. He tries to keep his debts private, to keep them betzina, in order that people will not offer less because they know he's under pressure, but to buy his properties from him. Zvini man and Arab but there's no similar svara when someone purchases property, why he has to keep it a secret. Adarabba. When he sells his property, people think he's flush with cash, and he has more leverage in his negotiations when he's selling. So that's the nafkamina in the two situations of Rav. What we had first quoted from Rav was talking about that when Levi buys a property from Reuven, he's aware of Shimon's purchase earlier because Shimon and Reuven publicized that sale. But this thing that we're saying now, that Malva al peh in a that's talking about a Malva, where Reuven had borrowed money, and that a later lekeach, unless it's done with star, he's not going to know about, because just having it bepeh is not enough, because people try to hide. He'll tell the Adam not to say anything about it. Tanarabban. Achol ha'av shana v'haben shtayim. If we're going back to our din of a cheskes gimel shana, so that Rav had said shalosh lekuchas mitzdarf, and you could have three purchasers on mitzdarf to make a chazak. If a father did one of the 3 years of chazaka and then the son did two, or the other way around, the father did two and then the son did one, meaning the father died and the son took over. Or if you had first the father did the first year, he died, and then his son was yerush for the next year, and then the son sold it to a third person. So tomorrow, so you see from this, remember, so this seems to be saying like Rav was saying that like Rav, even like the member of our Gemara that we said shalosh lekuchas mitzdarfim. Remember, so the mashmois from this is that the original owner is aware that this was sold from one to the other, and therefore there is a chazaka. Ramini achom uvnei avshan. If someone, this is the other way around, where the original owner was a father, and then the father who was, let's say, Ruvain, died, and then in the meantime, Ruvain was the previous owner of a property. He's the Marakama on the property, and now Shimon and Levi, Yehuda, and Yisachar had a cheskes. Let's say Yehuda is making a cheskes gimel shanim on Reuven's property, but the father died during Levi's cheskes gimel shanim, and Shimon took over the property from Reuven. Shimon's Reuven's son. So Achel b'fnei Av Shana, in front of the father Reuven 1 year, b'fnei Ben Shtayim, and then 2 years while Shimon was the son, Levi was making chazaka while Shimon didn't say anything. B'fnei Av Shtayim, b'fnei Ben Shana, all the other way around. B'fnei Av Shana, b'fnei Ben Shana, b'fnei Lekeach Shana. Or if he did it even in front of Reuven and Shimon, the father and the son, were the first 2 years of Levi's chazaka. But then Shimon sold it to Yehuda. That means while Shimon was being muktzah, Shimon sold Yehuda. Harezu chazak. It's still a good chazak. So if you say lekech, when something is sold, there's a kyle. How can you say that Shimon was muktzah in it when first Reuven held it as the father? I mean, first Reuven was the father for the first year of chazak, and then he died, and Shimon took over the ownership of this property, the putative ownership, and then Shimon sold it to Yehuda. But Shimon selling it to Yehuda is saying that it's not Shimon, that it doesn't belong to Levi. So how can Levi have a chazaka? There was a sale of the property. Zak to Gemara. So the chayrim must be that it seems to indicate that Shimon would not be aware of this sale. So you see from here that a person doesn't become aware of a sale on a property. Amra Papa Kitanyahi b'meichas. He says no. That's you're misunderstanding the case over there. What happened was Reuven he was Donald Trump. He had many hotels and golf courses and properties, and Donald Trump died, and Don Jr. took over. And in the meantime, Shimon was sitting on one golf course, and he was machzik in it. Then Don Jr. went and sold the whole thing to everything, all the properties of his father, he went and sold to a third party. So he's not specifically selling this property. So when it's included in the sale of the entire estate, there's no notice given to the muhsik that he has to hold on to his shtar because there was a macha. That's not a macha. That's just a sale of the entire property, but he assumes this isn't included because I bought it already. And therefore, after 3 years, he loses his shtar. Dr. Mishnah, ha'omnin, someone who is an omen, he's a shoemaker, and he gets he's holding on to a shoe. He says, I made a chazaka in the shoe. It's a metaltalin, so I can make a chazaka right away. We only need a chesed gimel shanim on property, on karka, but on metaltalin, I could make a chazaka right away. He says, I have a chazaka. V'ashutfin, if Reuven and Shimon own property together, and Reuven is on the property by himself for 3 years. V'arisin, Reuven owns property, and Shimon is an aris, and Shimon is claiming that I have a chazaka because I was here for 3 years. Apotropin is basically a manager. You hired a manager to take care of your property, and the manager's on the property for 3 years. All these don't have chazaka because there's a different explanation of why they were on the property, or in the first case, why the shoemaker had in his hands the shoe. Similarly, a man doesn't get a chazaka and his wife's, let's say, nichsei melug, because he's supposed to be getting the paris. So he's taking the paris because that's the din of nichsei melug. And also, a woman doesn't have a chazaka in her husband's property, because very often husbands will give their wives rishus to take. She can go collect the tomatoes from the tomato patch every day. That's her mezainis. The father doesn't have a chazaka in the property of his son, or vice versa, because each one of them would not make a macha if the other one's using it. The father often will have his son work for him, and the son will often be given the rights to eat from his father's property. So therefore, there's no chazak. Now the Mishnah is making an important distinction. We know there's two types of chazakas. Until this point in Cheskas Sabat, and what we've been talking about is the Cheskas Gimel Shanim, which is a raya. So that's what we're talking about. All these are not chazakas. Is only talking about someone who's trying to make a Cheskas Gimel Shanim, a raya that it was sold to him. Aval benoisa matana ba'achan cholku. If Reuven is giving Shimon a matana, or brothers who are separating an estate, or someone who's making a chazaka in the nechasim of a ger who has no yirish, null god of a parts culture who are raised a chazaka. You can make a chazaka, like we said, a karka is kinyan b'kasef b'shtar b'chazaka. That chazaka that you kind of karka with is not the chazaka of Gimel Shanim. That's a chazaka that demonstrates ownership. It's a way of making a kinyan, and the Mishnah just saying that has nothing to do. All these types of kinyanim can be done. Doesn't make a difference if it's a shutif, if it's a what do you call it, an omen. You can make a kinyan with a chazaka. It's not precluded by the fact that you are an aris, or you are allowed to have access to the property. Dr. Gemara, Avu de Shmuel v'Levi Tanu. In the list of types of cases where we say there's no chazaka, they learned shutaf ein lechazaka v'chol shechein omen. A shutaf doesn't have a chazaka, in spite of the fact that there's a reason to say that a shutaf there could be a chazaka, a cheskas gimel shalam, because as we've had a number of times, we learned in Hashutvin, the first parak, that often shutvin will buy each other out. So there is reason to presume that there was a sale by a shutuf, because that's a normal type of business, is that one will buy out another. Even so, it's not a chazaka, because like we said, they often will make a deal where one will work on the land and the other won't. So we don't look at it, the fact that one is on it for 3 years, it doesn't mean the other one will protest, even though he didn't sell it. And certainly omen is not going to be a chazaka. Shmuel Tani, Omen Ein Lechazak, Al V'Shutav Yesh Lechazak. Shmuel has a different version of our Mishnah. He says Ein Chanami. A shutav there is a chazaka, like because of the svara that we just said, that shutman often will sell one to the other. Since he already has some property, he owns half of the property. There's reason to believe he bought the rest of it. What's the Shmuel Atamed? Shmuel is going l'shitasai. Amar Shmuel. Hashuftim machzikin zel zeh. Shutman can make a chazaka one on another, and they could say edus against one another. They're not considered a geya be'edus. The Gemara later on is going to explain why. If one of them is watching the property by himself, the entire property, we say he's doing it in return for the fact that he's going to get that the other person is going to watch the property the next year or the next day. So therefore, he's considered like he's being paid to watch. If something happens to his partner's property, he's treated like a shem masacha, like someone who's a paid watchman, not like a shem mechina. But in any case, the first thing we said, b'shem Shmuel, was that hashutman hamachzikin zelzeh. There is a chazaka from one shutaf on another. We don't say that he has a right to be there, and therefore the shutaf would not protest. Rami le Rabbi Abel Rabbi Yehuda b'marosa de Rav Zakai. Rav Abba asked Rabbi Yehuda when they were in the cave of Rav Zakai, Mi Amar Shmuel shutaf yeshel chazaka. Is it true that Shmuel holds that one shutaf, one partner, when he uses the whole field, is considered that he has a chazaka against, he used it for 3 years, he could claim that he lost the star and he owns the field. Amar Shmuel, shutaf ki yared b'shustami. That a shutaf is like a oris. A oris is someone or someone who's entitled who bought Paris that he can't claim chazak. Lav lememra the shut of ein lechazaka. Is it not saying that he's considered like a Yerid B'Shus, that he doesn't have the ability to claim he was a muktzah? Rather, he just, when he's on it, he's treated as if he was given the Paris. He said, like we explained, that maybe he was given that he could get the Paris for 3 years, and the Shuttas going to get the next 3 years, but it's not a chazaka. So we're being mechalik. The case where one of the cases is talking about, meaning the case where we say it is a chazaka, or the case that it's not talking where it's not a chazaka, it's talking about where the shutaf was on the entire field, and one is talking about where he was on part of the field. Zak the Gemara, Amri lo lahai gisa v'amri lo lahai gisa. And this can be explained that either the Manda Amar who said that either the case of where he went on the whole field, that's the reason why it should be a chazaka, or you could say, understand the other way, that it's the reason why it's not a chazaka. And the svara would be, like we said, someone who has a field b'shutvis. Generally, he doesn't want to go not getting anything out of his field. So where was he made a chazak on half the field, that makes sense. But to say that the whole field went to one shutuf for 3 years in a row, it's unlikely that the shutuf would agree to it. So therefore, if one partner is on the field for 3 years in a row, he probably has a chazaka. Or you could say that sometimes you will do the other way around. The fact that he doesn't care if the other guy gets 3 years. He's going to get his 3 years later. But if someone has a half of a year, if one of the partners is making chazak in half of the property, each half is going to have a different type of return. So he's not going to want to have, once they're splitting up and you're doing half of the property. He's going to want to do a rotation every year so you can get the better half of the property. So therefore, if someone has half of the property for 3 years in a row, that's more of a reason to say it's a chazaka, as opposed to where the other partner has the entire property. Ravina Amar Hava Hadanakas Lakula. Ravina says, no, we're not making this chachiluk. Both cases, both shitas, both where we said that a shutuf has a chazaka when he said the shutuf doesn't. They're both talking about where the shutuf had the entire property for 3 years. Well, like kasha, hada is bidin chaluka, hada less bidin chaluka. The nafkamina is whether the size of this field. If it's a field that's less than 8 amas big, so it's not so typical to work half of it. You don't, just like we don't divide it in half, you don't usually work half. So it makes sense that one guy is working for it the whole time, because he'll work it for 3 years and the other one will work it for 3 years, because it's not divisible in half. So it makes sense that one person would work for it by himself. But on the other hand, if it's more than a din chalukah, then we say taka, there's no chazak. Gufam Shmuel, shutaf ki yored b'shus dami. We just said that Shmuel said his shutaf that means that he's treated like a aris or like someone who bought the Paris. My kamashim shutaf ein chazaka, lame shutaf ein chazaka. Why don't we just say that a shutaf ein chazaka? That's what the result of it is. Amar Nachman Rabbi Avua, loy meshenoita b'shvacha megia l'sach b'sada she'en yasu yalita kesada halu hasu yalita. In the essence, what the Gemara is answering is that we're talking about the Paris of the time of chazaka. We're saying he doesn't have a chazaka. What it means to say is not just that he doesn't have a chazaka, but he's kiyared b'shus, that even though normally someone who is yared shaloi b'shus, if there is Paris on the property that are magil ksaf, they're ready to be cut off, that person is not going to be. He's going to have to pay back for the Paris that were. He's not going to get paid for any Paris that were about to be harvested, because he didn't do anything to that. But if he's someone who's yared delirshus, he was asked to take care of the field. He will get paid. He will get compensated for taking care of that property. We're saying that he's able to do that this person is going to be treated as someone who's yoyer l'rishus legabe that property. Okay, we'll stop over here and we'll continue tomorrow.